In this video, you will analyze events leading to tension between the colonists and King George III of Great Britain. Open your notes section, make sure and take good detailed notes, and write down any questions you may have or any clarification that you need on any of the information in this presentation. So we'll start off by looking at the relationship between King George and the colonies. It's important to note that they're separated by almost 3,000 miles of open ocean. So when the king tries to rule the colonies, it's very difficult because of how far away they are. And the king is going to try to start putting taxes on the colonists and making new laws that are very unfair to the colonists, and it's going to be difficult for him to enforce them. Here is a short list of some of the events that took place in the late 1700s that begin to frustrate the colonists. Unfair acts and taxes and events placed upon them by the king. And we'll go through these one at a time. These events are also located in your graphic organizer. Any information that you don't have completed here, you can get from this presentation. The Proclamation of 1763, this is the first event we'll look at, takes place after the French and Indian War, and it was created to help avoid conflict with the Indians in the Ohio Valley. The king was worried that after the war, the colonists might not have a great relationship with the Indians in the Ohio Valley, so he made a law that said that colonists were forbidden to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. And right off the bat, this is going to anger the colonists. The next thing we're going to look at was called the Stamp Act. And it's not the kind of stamp you might be thinking about. It's not a postage stamp. It's a stamp kind of like the Mr. Bain stamp in class. A rubber stamp that you would dip in ink and then you could stamp papers with it to identify that they had been certified by the British government. And the Stamp Act put a tax on paper, legal documents, licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, and playing cards. So if you were living in the colonies and you wanted to buy any of these things, you had to make sure they had that stamp on them. And if they did have a stamp on them, you know that they were taxed. And you would also know that they were approved by the British government. Now you could buy these things without the stamp, but then you would be breaking the law. And the colonists said it was taxation without representation. The Sons of Liberty were formed to oppose this unfair act. And the colonists rioted and harassed tax collectors, which means that when tax collectors came around to collect their money, the colonists would yell at them and insult them and possibly even beat them up. Eventually, this was repealed or taken away in 1766. Next came the Quartering Act of 1765. And this said that the colonists had to provide housing, bedding, candles, and beverages for British soldiers. Even if there was no war going on, if British soldiers showed up at your house, you had to let them in to stay there and you had to take care of them. New York refused to do this, so the king dismissed their assembly. Their assembly was the group of people that made the laws in New York, and when they refused to follow the Quartering Act, the king said, you can't meet anymore to lead the colony, and if you do, you'll be breaking the law. The Townshend Acts. These put a tax on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea. And tax collectors were given writs of assistance to look for smuggled goods. These were pieces of paper put out by the British government that said if a tax collector suspected that someone was smuggling goods, was illegally buying and selling goods, that these tax collectors could just go into their house and search all their stuff looking for smuggled goods. Again, another way that the king violated the colonists' basic rights. Eventually, the king had to send troops to Boston to restore order. Then came the Boston Massacre of 1770. On a cold, wintry night in Boston, there were soldiers and there were colonists, and the colonists started yelling and teasing and taunting the soldiers because the soldiers were seen as a threat in Boston. Crowd gathers and began to yell insults and to throw snowballs and even rocks at the soldiers. The soldiers became very afraid. Someone fired their rifle. We don't know if it was a colonist or if it was a British soldier, but a shot was fired and 5 colonists were left dead, including Crispus Attucks, who was an African American that was also leading the protesters. The results were that the soldiers were tried for murder but found not guilty by reason of self defense. John Adams, the man who would eventually become a second president of the United States, actually defended the British soldiers and was able to convince the court that they were acting in self defense rather than massacring innocent civilians. Now, this is a very famous picture that was released not long after the violence in Boston. I want you to take a look at it for a couple minutes and think to yourself, if this picture got released to the colonists all up and down the colonies, all the way down to Georgia, South Carolina, all the way through Maryland and Pennsylvania, if this got released, how could it be used to turn the colonists against the British? If people wanted to convince the colonists that the British were really, really rotten, how might this picture do that? So pause the video and look at it for a minute and see if you can come up with any reasons. Okay, if you weren't able to come up with any, let's see if I can come up with a few. Well, first off, it looks like the British are firing into a crowd of unarmed civilians. No one on the side of the colonists has a gun. So that makes it look more like a massacre. Also, only the colonists are being injured. There are no injured British soldiers. Also, it looks like the attack is completely unprovoked. In other words, it looks like the colonists aren't doing anything but just gathering there when the British soldiers fired. And lastly, it's a little hard to read, but here at the top, the title of this picture was actually called The Bloody Massacre. So that alone, just by reading the title, it sounds like it's some kind of war crime, something really, really terrible that the British did. Now, we learned that that's not what actually happened. It was actually much different than this. But these are 4 ways that this could be used to turn the colonists against the British. I'm going to give them to you here. And make sure and write these down. There will be an essay that you'll be writing where you need to answer that question. So make sure and put these into your notes. Next came the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. Tea Act allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonists. Colonial merchants and smugglers thought it would put them out of business. And the Boston Tea Party was when the colonists disguised themselves as Indians and dumped tea into Boston Harbor. Now, I don't want you to think that the harbor in Boston turned into a giant cup of tea. It didn't work that way. But there were Many barrels of tea that were destroyed. And remember, this was British tea. So this was money that Great Britain would have made that was all destroyed and cost them a lot of money. And the main effect of the Boston Tea Party was that it showed the British how unhappy the colonists were with the new laws. Then came the Intolerable Acts of 1774. The king punishes the colonists for the Boston Tea Party, and he closes the port of Boston, which means that anyone who made their living off of goods coming in to Boston or shipping goods out of Boston now couldn't make a living because the port was closed off. Massachusetts charter is canceled. Their charter basically said that Massachusetts was officially a colony and that they could govern themselves, and the king said no longer. Any royal or British officials charged with a crime in the colonies were sent to Great Britain for trial. British General Gage became the new governor of Massachusetts. So now we actually have a British general in charge of the American colony of Massachusetts. So the colonists institute an embargo or boycott on goods coming from Great Britain, meaning that they would not buy any goods coming from Great Britain. And this cost Great Britain a lot of money and angered the king even further. And this resulted in the creation of the First Continental Congress, which you can see here, gathering of George Washington and others to discuss what should we do about the conflict that the colonies have with the British king. And lastly, the battles at Lexington and Concord, the first two battles of the Revolutionary War. Lexington is a small town in Massachusetts, and Concord is as well, not far from Lexington. General Gage learns that colonists were storing a stockpile of weapons in Concord. The general believes that colonists are getting ready to wage war in Concord, so he's going to go there. And the Minutemen, who were colonial soldiers that supposedly could be ready to fight in a minute, are warned by Paul Revere, who you have probably heard of. But there were also two other men that warned the colonists that the British were coming: William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. It was usually you hear as Paul Revere's ride, but it was actually a three-part ride, not just Paul Revere. The first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired in Lexington, and they were known as the shot heard round the world. And that was because this was the start of the American Revolution, and it's going to impact the whole world. The British couldn't find any weapons in Concord and were attacked by Minutemen as they retreated back to Boston. So the colonists lost the battle at Lexington. The British went on to Concord and were defeated by the colonists and had to retreat all the way back to Boston. And this is kind of where we'll conclude, because after this we're talking about the battles of the Revolutionary War. Here you can see a map, the harbor in Boston, and they marched to Lexington, and then on to Concord, and then all the way back to Boston Harbor. So coming up next is the actual battles of the Revolutionary War. Again, as usual, you can rewind this video to any point that you need to, and make sure and see me for any clarification you may need.